Welcome to this week's edition of Invest Africa. I'm Bronwyn Nielsen. Over the next 30 minutes, we'll be taking an in-depth look at the challenges and opportunities associated with the state of power on the continent. It's been more than a century since the invention of the light bulb, yet most of the African continent continues to be in the dark at nightfall. Rolling blackouts and an unpredictable energy supply are some of the challenges facing the sector right now. Today, we aim to shed some light on Africa's energy story.
A widely seen image, but this, however, is not just a snapshot of the world at night, but a geographical representation showing economic activity, where sub-Saharan Africa is largely void of illuminated cities. According to the UN, over 600 million Africans do not have access to electricity power and mostly rely on biomass, namely wood, coal and charcoal. With just under $11 billion spent on low-quality fuel-based lighting by sub-Saharan countries. With 15 years of experience in the renewable energy industry, Hannes Fall knows the grave social costs associated with inefficient energy resources.
The World Health Organization did a study where they found that 2 million people per year die from lung infections and lung diseases from smoke inhalation. That's mostly because they cook indoors and they inhale those smoke, the smoke and the fumes from paraffin lamps, etc., etc.
On average, an African manufacturer in the informal sector may lose as much as 6% of revenue sales from an interrupted power supply, and where power generation is limited, it can climb to as much as a 20% revenue loss. The estimated economic cost of load shedding is equivalent to a 2.1% of GDP. However, power shortages have brought a number of new projects to the fore, with large multinational companies establishing and growing a presence, particularly as natural gas discoveries have made combined cycle plants competitive. Over the last 10 years, common trends in most African countries have been privatization and restructuring of government-owned power companies.
Ultimately, somebody needs to pay. How should that be handled? Should bonds be issued and the cost shared by a broader society? These are the questions and the issues that we expect to emerge from this process. And really, the end goal is to figure out how we can accelerate investments in these projects. So it's not as easy as saying, this is the bill, right? This is how much it costs, but why isn't it flowing?
Regular and consistent power supply will do much to attract foreign investment and entice international companies to establish operations in Africa. However, if limited power capacity, high electricity tariffs and instability in the political environment continue to plague Africa's energy sector, this may very well pull the plug on Africa's growth story. But there is light at the end of the tunnel. With the persistent call for sustained energy production getting louder, environmental considerations are also becoming of increasing concern to the industry, as government brings environmental policies into line with those of the rest of the world.
Joining me in the studio to take a closer look at the state of power on the continent is Paul Yeardley-Taylor, Head of Oil and Gas, Standard Bank, Jean Mazongwe, she's Energy Specialist from the DBSA, and Klaus Findt, he's CEO Global Infrastructure at KPMG. Thank you all for joining me. In terms of the debate and power on the African continent, firstly, can I start with the clean power aspect? Can we hope to follow the developed world when we are an emerging continent? I know this is a big question, deserves a big answer, but Paul, perhaps I can throw this to you in the beginning.
Yeah, sure. I think there's a couple of things that are relevant in the African space at the moment. I think the first thing on the renewable side is as renewable technology has got more mature in many other places, the costs have come down. With the structural scale of African power prices in many countries, especially those dependent on diesel, and many alternative energy options, for example, photovoltaic solar, are becoming more and more competitive by the day. I think the second issue that's relevant is the discovery of hydrocarbons in many African countries, offshore Mozambique, offshore Tanzania, possibility of Kenya, expanded production in Angola, and it's highly likely that cheap natural gas will also help regenerate and revitalise the African power sector over the next few years.
Do you believe that cheap natural gas is going to revitalise the energy sector on the African continent in the next couple of years? You allude to Mozambique, and of course that is a hotspot right now in terms of gas discovery.
Yes, definitely. I think in Mozambique it will have got a major future aspect, and Mozambique will go very big times. But however, coming back to the renewable side, what the African countries also need is baseload power, and the renewable like photovoltaic does not really allow for baseload power. So therefore, coming back to your initial question, I believe yes, renewables has to play the role, but we need also thermal power like coal power plants in the African continent, and these are the resources which are there and must be also utilized.
Gina, is this the Achilles heel of the African continent?
Well,
energy disruption.
Well, I think that we actually have an opportunity here where we have a region that's got an abundance of both thermal energy resources as well as hydro potential. And I think what we should be looking at really is to try and take advantage and exploit the hydro potential. There's a huge hydro potential that's not been exploited, particularly as we look at the Southern African region, SADC region, which is the area that the DBSA tends to focus on in the region. Large hydro potential in countries in Angola, in Mozambique, in DRC Congo. And I think it's a question of getting all those hydroelectric projects developed up there. A lot of them have had preliminary work that's been done on them. There's studies that have taken place on those projects. It's about developing them. And as mentioned before, you need a mix. You need a mix because you need baseload power to meet the daily demands of power. And then you can bring in your renewables, your smaller IPP projects and smaller solar projects to meet the peaking power.
As Jean says, hydropower, big focus for the DBSA. Are those hydro projects lagging other projects on the continent when it comes to energy?
No, the hydropower projects have got their own challenge because you've got a very huge initial capex requirement for this. But when you look at, we have got existing one, it's Korabasa or also Koriba North in Zambia or Koriba South for Zimbabwe, where just the expansion of these projects is going on. Saying this also, when you look at Inga, for example, you mentioned
in
the DRC, where we've got the potential at one spot of 45 gigawatt, which is compared to the consumption in South Africa currently 40 gigawatt, it will lighten up the whole continent. However, it always comes down, and is discussed for the last 40, 50 years, to make it a structure into a commercial viable project. And then these challenges around African countries come into the play, to the game.
High capex in the hydro space, what are we looking for when it comes to typical funding models around energy, around oil and gas, those areas that you play in?
I think the start point on the funding model debate, and we're obviously aware of the debate, is whether the individual project is targeted at a domestic audience or whether it sells its product internationally. If it has an internationally tradable commodity, for example a mining product, oil and gas, it tends to be able to raise more capital over long tenors and is able to sort of pierce the country ceiling in the industry jargon. Whereas if it's focused on a domestic audience, classically electricity project of any technology, the ability to raise funds is typically capped by the liquidity and the savings with an individual country, and then on top of that by its ability to borrow from other countries. So I suspect one of the things we'll see over the next few years is there'll be lots of debate and discussion in countries such as Mozambique and Tanzania as to how best to monetize the natural resources, how much of it will be used domestically and how much of it will be sold abroad in the form of liquefied natural gas or petrochemicals. And typically this is formed, the debate is sort of formed and shaped through what's known as a natural gas plan, and there's lots of debate before that gets settled.
Klaus, who is throwing money at the energy problem on the continent?
I just came back last week from Beijing, and the Chinese are definitely pulling money into the African continent, always driven also by the resources, but also EPC contractors like Sino-Hydro, CMEC, Gejuba, they're very interested, and they also attract export funding from China in this regard. So what's missing from other parts, even if the DBSA is playing a very important role in this part, but also they can on their balance sheet not fund $1 billion, neither Standard Bank. So you need the combination of export credit insurance from other countries, and that China is very attractive at this point in time, to get these projects up and running. And it's very important, these projects are structured on a commercial basis, and therefore, even if it's in domestic market, or if it's in Mozambique or Zimbabwe or South Africa, they all compete about the same off-taker, because you need long-term US dollar predictable power purchase agreements to make this happen, and therefore you're in a competitive situation also.
Jean, where's the support coming from in this space? You're on the ground there, you're spending a lot of money in the energy environment and building infrastructure. Are you getting support?
Absolutely. Power projects tend to be long-term in gestation because there's a long period to prepare and develop. So you tend to find there's a different group of players that will come in to support the development of that project. We rely a lot on having a good, strong sponsor with equity to put into the project, as well as for the long-term concessionary debt funding that's normally provided by development finance institutions like ourselves, the African Development Bank, the World Bank. They're all playing in that space. These are institutions that have been in the power sector for a very, very, very long time. And with the region opening up a lot to IPP development, we're finding that a lot of private players are coming into that space as well. But they have to be patient because it's really long term, as I've mentioned earlier. So the returns may be longer.
Paul, Klaus mentioned the Chinese. Obviously, that money is forthcoming. Are we past bashing the Chinese? Do we celebrate their play on the continent, specifically in the energy space?
I think what's most interesting about Africa really is the number of different liquidity pools that target the continent. Perhaps there's a slightly different liquidity pool set for power, but certainly in oil and gas you'll see the involvement of Western investors, listed companies, just as much as the new sovereign wealth funds. And it isn't just the Chinese who are looking quite actively at Africa. You also have Indian oil companies, for example, or most notably at the moment there's a takeover battle between the Thais and Shells for a minority stake in the major gas fields offshore of Mozambique. So I think what really comes through is the scale of the resources that are there to be taken out of the ground and paid an economic price for in Africa is really attracting every major liquidity pool, not just China but elsewhere.
Is this the biggest hotspot on the African continent, Klaus?
The power.
The power,
definitely.
Energy.
We've got around about 1 billion people. It will go up by in the next 40 years to 2 billion people. And as you have got in your trailer, we've got only electrification rate of 20 to 30%. So we're lacking behind, and it will drive all the other industries, and therefore it's very important. It's the highest on the priorities, definitely.
And Jean, let's just get your final comments on the power.
Yes, definitely. The other driver for that is also the rate of industrial growth. We're finding a lot of growth in the mining sector as well as in industry. So there's a lot of urbanization as well, which is driving up the electrification rates and the demand for electricity and power. Our electrification rates in the region are very, very low. You find that we are ranging from 6% in some countries to 20 or 30% in some regions, in the SADC region in particular. So really there's a high demand and drivers for growth.
Thank you all for joining me. It's been a pleasure having you on the show. We're going to a quick commercial break. When we come back, we'll be delving into power generation on the continent and alternative energy. Stay with us. Investors and world leaders are seeking a new clean energy frontier, and the African continent could become a goldmine for renewable energy due to the abundance of solar and wind energy. But the roadblocks to clean energy are amplified throughout the continent due to financial constraints and inadequate infrastructure. Let's take a look.
There are a number of projects in the pipeline, all geared at leapfrogging Africa's economy, and energy infrastructure is taking center stage. Modest starts in renewable energy have already begun across the continent. Wind power projects including Kenya's 0.3 gigawatt Late Turkana project and 0.3 gigawatt of capacity under construction in Morocco development. However, are energy sources such as wind turbines overhyped?
This turbine has zero impact on the environment at all, and on no climate change. It doesn't kill fish, it doesn't disturb fauna and flora. It's just totally harmless. And it's really very easy to install. It's literally, you put it in the water, let it float on the river, plug it in and the lights go on.
Although alternative energy is a welcomed concept, there are criticisms around energy sources such as nuclear power.
We have abundant resources, renewable energy resources, and we don't need nuclear energy. In Africa, I don't think it's feasible to think of nuclear power plants all over the African continent. The infrastructure is just not there. I also think it's better to generate power where you need it, like distributed energy. You have small grids that are connected to the big grid, but they're independent. With a nuclear power plant, you have to have hundreds and hundreds of kilometers of power lines going all over the place. Extremely expensive infrastructure. And I don't know that it's all that safe.
But nuclear physicist Dr. Calvin Kim is not convinced that energy sources such as solar, wind and hydro are sustainable and reliable enough to power Africa's growth.
I must emphasize I'm not opposed to solar and wind where solar and wind are genuinely economically viable, which usually means smaller standalone units far away from a main electricity supply. But it's wrong and, if anything, immoral to tell people that you can run a country on solar power and wind power when you only get wind when the wind blows and you only get solar power when the sun shines.
Given past projects such as the South African 9.2 billion rand Pebble Bed modular reactor project that was abandoned in 2010 has raised questions around whether Africa has the funding, adequate security and regulatory framework in place to embark on such an endeavour.
What's very important with nuclear is to have a good regulatory environment. Any country wanting to go into nuclear must abide by the requirements of the International Atomic Energy Agency. The country needs to have a national nuclear regulator to ensure that the whole operation of a nuclear plant is done according to international standards.
Although the debates continue regarding which energy source will best serve Africa's advancement, it is reassuring to know that African leaders are doing their due diligence and are not just taking a shot in the dark. Dumisha Makhanyele, Johannesburg.
Joining me in studio to discuss alternative energy is Kadri Nasipi, CEO of South African National Energy Development Institute, Sanedi, and Thomas Garner, CEO of Synergy, and Silas Zumu. He's the CEO of Suzlon Wind Energy South Africa. Before we go any further, gentlemen, can we just get one thing out of the way? In terms of the base load, aren't we always going to have to rely on coal? Because neither wind nor solar are going to be able to provide the base load. Kadri, let's get your thoughts.
Thanks, Bronwyn. I think first of all we have to understand that we do have a rather extensive supply of coal left in the country, and of course the coal mining industry and power generation sector relies exclusively on that for job creation in the country. So we do have a limitation in the sense that we have to secure long-term job creation for the country. There are other options as well. The shale gas issue, which has raised its head, of course, in the Karoo, is one that also
How can we forget the fracking issue?
Absolutely, but it raises the interesting question of how sustainable can we be with gas, given that there's of course the environmental constraints that go with it. But renewable energy has got a significant role to play in that regard because it's an emerging technology base in which to localize content. It's the one thing that we don't have is a manufacturing capacity, and there are companies that are willing to invest in this country to bring renewable energies and create jobs at the same time.
Silas, is it fair to put first world demands on third world people? And I asked my guests in the first half the same question.
I think by the megawatt consumption that South Africa is consuming, or Africa is to consume, we are a first world country. The demand determines that we are a first world country. Yes, the currencies may differ, but wherever you need to get an economy running positively in a sustainable manner, you need electricity there first. So you can't, on electricity, it's either first or second or third world. We need it to ensure that we can then get our economy running. And everybody has been saying we need an energy mix. We should not say only coal or only nuclear or only wind. It's an energy mix. We already have enough on the coal side. And what we're saying is due to climate change, which is a reality, we also need to start bringing in renewable energy into the mix.
What is the ideal mix? This must have been debated amongst the experts.
Bronwyn, from my view, I think the ideal mix is a mix where there's a good baseload supplied by that type of technology, which is normally coal or nuclear, and it can be a combination of that. then also large hydro, and then made up also then of renewables, wind, solar. There's various other technologies, biomass, biogas. Gas as well is available in Africa. So the mix for me is a mix where you need to look at what's economically viable for the continent and for the region, and then also at your grid emission factor. And currently the grid emission factor in the Southern African region is probably around 1 ton of CO2 per megawatt hour. And I think we should target anywhere between 0.3 and 0.7 tons of CO2 per megawatt hour.
Kadri, do you agree with that mix as put forward by Thomas?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, obviously we have to find a space for gas. I'm going to come back to the shale gas because I think it's something that has to be looked at in the future very seriously. But absolutely, there's got to be room for coal. Currently, we're looking at carbon capture and sequestration as being the way to actually utilize coal in the future, because that's got to be the issue. How do we capture and store carbon dioxide underground if we are going to use coal in the future? That's got to be addressed. The nuclear issue on storage of spent waste, that's got to be sorted out as well. But certainly on the renewable side, to come in from a load following perspective, making sure that we can harness renewable energy as and when it becomes available. So I'd have to agree with that energy mix.
In terms of coal, are we somewhat schizophrenic about coal?
I think we actually don't understand the advantages of coal completely. I mean, coal is a cheap, abundant resource in South Africa and Botswana, for instance, many other African countries, and we should use that. But we should be responsible in the way we use it. And in any technology that you put on, from wind to coal, there's an environmental impact, and we need to manage that.
What about nuclear after the Japanese furore? Is that not the dirtiest of all words when it comes to energy at the moment?
Look, if you look at the probabilities of what could be happening with Japan being the second disaster on nuclear, and comparing it to the number of years when nuclear stations were started, really you can ignore the number. Okay, the big factor is the fear it brings, the life-threatening fears that it has brought, what brought the attention of the world now rethinking, is nuclear the best? But we should also analyze the design of what happened in Japan. If you look at their design of that station, there's things that they could have done better, and this is where the experts should be coming in to say, for us not to repeat the Japanese experience, how are we going to design our South African stations?
We obviously look at nuclear as part of South Africa's future, strongly into 2012. It's in the plans going forward. Is there a health risk in terms of the Pelindaba plant recently and incidents there?
Well, we've been operating those type of reactors for the past, going on 30 years at least, and so we've got quite a good history of being able to manage both at Pelindaba as well as at the Koeberg nuclear power station. So I think we've actually set up quite a thriving industry around radioactive isotopes and the management thereof. So yeah, from a spent fuel perspective, we probably need to manage that far more effectively, but I think on the whole, the newer generation of nuclear plants offers so much more in terms of safety. And obviously, if you look at the Fukushima Daiichi reactor as an example, you can't locate a nuclear reactor in one of the most seismically active areas in the world and not expect to have some kind of fallout, literally in this case. So there's got to be that type of consideration built into the design factor. And
but now the Germans are giving up the nuclear path, and they want it out of the way by 2020. Shouldn't we be following that example?
Well, in the case of supply constraints in terms of their own source of renewable energy, they can obviously rely on the French to provide them with nuclear energy from across the border. So they have that luxury. We don't have that luxury.
Well, we don't want to get into the Germany-France debate right now. We'll leave that to the economists.
But I agree. But I mean, yes, in an ideal world, yes, you'd want to move away to a technology that offers so much less in the way of security risk. However, at the same time, we have to ask ourselves, and this is in response to the earlier point about emission factors, if you want to move closer and closer to a lower emission factor, you have to consider then the fact that nuclear offers as an interim solution a far better proposition than what we have on the table right now.
Silas, there are experts out there who say that you need a farm as big as the entire Western Cape in either the solar space or the wind space to power the whole of South Africa. Is that viable? Where's all this land going to come from?
The land has been there, and it's not been utilized for any other thing, not even on agriculture.
But what we should be looking at is the advantages that these wind farms, these solar farms are going to bring to the communities where not a single person for years has ever thought the Eastern Cape, the Northern Cape would have a stimulating economy like it does. I wish I was born from there, because I think these are going to change the socio-economic challenges that those people are going through. You cannot continue having people from those areas graduating and having to come look for work in Johannesburg, where they become tenants for life. This is going to change the things where we're going to create the jobs where those people are, and especially the Eastern Cape. You know, the Eastern Cape, I don't think in any map, or even 5 years ago, we had thought something like this is going to happen to them. And I don't think the people in the Eastern Cape are aware of the good that these are bringing to them.
How are we going to make coal commercially viable? Right now, it's too expensive for an emerging market, for a developing environment. We know what's happening purely on the electricity rates in South Africa. And of course, there's going to be a huge problem for power as it pervades the African continent.
I think if you look at coal-fired power, that is relatively cheap. It's one of the cheaper solutions. But I think competition in a market actually drives prices down. And we've seen it if you look at...
So you mean it's all in the monopoly right now?
I think it's all in the monopoly. And you can see that some of the wind power projects that were bid in the window 2 of the Renewable Energy Independent Program, those wind tariffs actually lower than the coal-fired tariffs of a Medupi and a Kusile would be in the longer run.
So let's welcome and bring on that competition in leaps and bounds. Gentlemen, thanks so much for your time. That's all we have time for on this edition of Invest Africa. We'll be back again at the same time next week. Until then, from me, Bronwyn Nielsen, and from my guests, it's goodbye.